a business anthropologist, educator, author, entrepreneur, and a strategic consultant to the tech giants, the founder of Stripe Partners and the board president of Epic, Simon Roberts.
Okay, lovely to be here. Thank you for having me. None of the slides that I'm going to present have been created by AI. It's also true to say that none of them have been created by me. So what do you do? I mean, this is a question that I get asked a lot of the time, and it's often at that point that I wish that I'd become a doctor or a lawyer or accountant, which is, I suspect, something that your parents hope that you would become too. Because I'm very, very bad at explaining what it is that I actually do. Yes, I do research. Yes, I do strategy. I help my clients. I do their dirty laundry. But what is it that I actually do? Well, of course, one of the answers is that I make slides. As I said, I didn't make these slides. I'm incredibly bad at making slides. And it's probably the part of my job that I actually least enjoy because I love doing field work and I love the sort of emotional and analytic labor of making sense of data. And one day a client said to me when we was talking about a possible project, what I really want is just one of those models that you people are good at creating. This was a guy I respected quite a lot, and being a subservient consultant, I just nodded my head and said, yes, we'll do this project and we'll make you a nice model. So we took the compliment and just moved on without thinking very much about what it was that he really was asking for. But that idea has stayed with me over the years, and I've thought quite a little bit about what it is in a model that's valuable for our clients. And today, really, what I want to do is make a simple point, I guess, or a couple of simple points. One of them is that models are extremely useful. They're our superpower, right? And in a world in which AI, as we've just seen, promises to either augment or indeed replace us, it behoves us to think a little bit more carefully about the process in which models get made and the value that they have. So really today I'm going to talk about, or try and answer for you, two questions. What are the underlying kind of mechanisms that make models powerful? And then secondly, what are the roles that they play in the work that we do? So there are models everywhere in the world, right? And depending on your occupational caste, the tribe that you're part of, those models can look very different. Whether you're a designer, whether you're a researcher like me, whether you're a management consultant, a banker, a consultant, models look different depending on which parts of these different worlds we come from. So there's a kind of a simple definition that I'll leave you with, and ironically or obviously enough, I'm going to give you a definition of a model, a working definition of a model that is indeed a model. And there's three very simple things that I think a model has as its essence that make them useful. Well, the first is that it's useful. The second is that it's clearly visual. And the third, that it relates in some way to some abstraction, some distillation, if you will, of things that we see out in the world. Now, I have to say that this talk is not all my work. It's not AI's work. This person was a hell of a lot more intelligent than any AI out there. And he was a guy called Alfred Gell, who died in the late 90s. He was an anthropologist. And he was famous ethnographically for doing work in Papua New Guinea and in India, actually, mainly because he didn't have a job and he was following his wife to Madhya Pradesh. But he's probably most famous for the work that he did on the anthropology of art, or what I would prefer to call the art of anthropology, because he was a very, very visual thinker. And anthropologists like me, we just do words, man. Words, 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 as Hamlet would have put it. But Gell was slightly different because, as he admitted, when I write, I see pictures in my head, and I write accordingly. The diagrams come first, and the text later. Now, I'm probably the opposite of that. I'm very, very verbose. I talk a lot and I write a lot of words. and I'm not very good at drawing. But his work is full of beautiful diagrams. He did amazing work on tattooing. He notated dance in different parts of the world and brought dance to life through visual imagery. But he has two essential ideas, I think, and I'm probably risking reducing, abstracting down to extremely his work is very kind of complex. It's mind-altering in where it takes you. And if you haven't read any of his work, go get it now. It's just amazing stuff. But he has two, I think, simple ideas which are useful for us today. And the first is that models conform to the very visual nature of cognition. And the second is that models are what he calls technologies of enchantment. So let's take that first one. Lots of people say, and you hear it said a lot, that 95% of the information that we use day to day is derived from visual sources. Now, claims like that are incredibly difficult to validate, but we do know that humans are extremely good at processing very quickly and very efficiently visual information. And the visual cortex in our brain takes up a hell of a lot of real estate. And people with very prodigious talents at memorizing very large quantities of data do so with the aid of what they call memory palaces. So you kind of give different numbers or objects, some sort of physical form in your brain, and that allows you to, memorize telephone books and other things like that, if that's your thing. But they're also very good, and visual sort of memory palaces have been around for a very, very long time, long before people did competitions to see how much they could memorize. But we also know that visual elements, visual aids enhance memory, comprehension, and problem solving. But of course, the other thing they're incredibly good at is communicating things to others. And I suspect that I'm in an audience which, for a living, whether you're a researcher or a designer, is trying to communicate things to other people, to have them easily comprehend what it is that you mean. But the world around us, of course, is full of things that are already made. And I think it's worth remembering, therefore, that the things that are made embody ideas that came from their creator. So when we see things, when we apprehend things that are out in the world, we're actually apprehending other people's thinking, because those objects, whether it's a piece of art or an advert or a piece of a user interface, they all embody somebody else's thinking. And it is through our visual, if you will, consumption that we take on board other people's ideas. Now, Gell, as I said, did field work in India, in Madhya Pradesh. And one of his famous essays called The Market Wheel talks about the weekly market that happened in this small town where very little happened most of the week, apart from this one weekly market, where everybody flooded in. And what he did in this essay is show how the layout of the market, both in terms of what was sold there, but also who sold it, gave a kind of a visual representation of the social and cultural hierarchies and relationships in the region. So the market, according to Gell, provides a sort of spatial representation of social relations. And I think what it does is remind us that if we attend to the visual in our work, it allows us a doorway into the relationships that the world exists on. And for me, models are all about relationships, and the sort of work that people like us do is all about relationships, both at a sort of a macro level, if you will, but also at a very micro level. And I think what models are trying to do is pull apart and abstract and then represent the way that things relate to each other. And of course, what we want to do as designers is have people relate to our products and services in meaningful ways. Now, Gell also wrote about things called nets. And this is a net made by the Zandi people. I don't think they're people that he studied. And Gell, of course, points out, which is entirely true, that this is a beautiful object, and it can be admired merely for its aesthetic qualities and for no other reason. And he made a point of showing a picture in one of his books of a net in a museum, such as its beauty. But he had a much deeper point, I think, which was that nets, to be effective, must take account of the particular animals' bodies and behaviors and ways of perceiving the world if it's to be successful. And models are very much the same, right? They're traps, if you will, right? And if we want to use them as traps to herd people into our way of thinking about the world, we need to think very carefully about who our victims are, if you will, right? If you're a consultant, then your victim is your client. And if you're going to trap them, you need to get into their heads. So just as Andy think deeply about the ways that fish operate, or the particular fish that they want to catch operate, so must we if we're going to catch our clients and persuade them, cajole them into our way of thinking. So models, or nets, as the case may be, are not just things. They're objects or artifacts, whether they're these nets, whether they're an old master's painting, whether they're an advertisement or whatever. They express ideas. They act as vehicles for some symbolic or social messages. And they catch us, right? They have agency. They're not just static nets in museums or static models on pages of PowerPoint. They're active agents in the world that change things. And in that sense, they're propaganda. And that's an important idea, because one inescapable fact of human society is often the powerful, but often the weak, if you're a consultant, are trying to secure the acquiescence, the agreement, right, the consensus of others as to not only how the world is now, but how it might be. And so I want you to take away this idea that the models you create are indeed propaganda that can capture people. Which kind of brings us to the second idea of Gell's, this idea that models are technologies of enchantment. Because he made this point that art objects, to sort of persuade people of the desirability of the order of things, or of things to come, need to enchant us. They need to grab us. So whether that's an advert or a painting or an ornate statue in a place of worship, right? They help us see the world in an enchanted form. They help us see it differently. So the question then becomes, how on earth do they do that? And Gell proposed that they do that through what he called the enchantment of technology. And by that he meant that the technical processes that are involved in their creation have the power to cast a spell. So he talked not about PowerPoint slides. He talked about nets. He talked about objects in museums. He talked about the material world a lot. But I think his ideas are just as applicable in the sorts of settings that we operate in. Because what we are trying to do is to cast a spell. And that involves thinking, he thought very much about craftspeople, about people carving, about people sculpting, and the ways in which the ideas that the people who beheld their creations had about the processes that were involved in the things that these craftspeople were creating. So the simple point here is that the technical processes matter. And perhaps with that in mind, I have some points of difference in respect of AI-generated stuff, and I'll come to that in a minute. Because I think it behoves us to think very much about the technical processes involved in what we do. This, I think, is a killer quote for me. I'd like to see some camera screens up. Because for me, this captures the very essence, not only of what Gell was talking about here, but I think the sorts of work that we're all involved in, right, which I think we might admit, since we have a day away from the office, are often extremely political, very hierarchical, very head-banging, very frustrating, But what we're essentially trying to do is to get people to perceive reality in the ways that we want them to perceive reality, right? And that may be true with your end product out in the world. I mean, that's a powerful thing to say, but it's true. You are trying to design things which change the way that people look at the world. And if, like me, you're a lowly consultant, you're trying to get your clients to perceive the world in a different way too. So I've left you with a couple of ideas, right? The first is about the very visual nature of cognition, the idea that if we look closely at the world and think visually about it, the ideas and relationships that underpin it can be revealed. And the second point is that the objects around us in the world, 2D, 3D, in museums, on billboards, it does not matter. But those things have the ability to cast spells, not only over us, but also over other people. So that's some thinking about models, which I hope is useful. And I've tried now to distill that into sort of 7 ideas, if you will, about the powers or the characteristics or the qualities of models. So the first is that models turn ambiguity into order. And hey, isn't there so much ambiguity in the world? I could talk about all of these models for a very long time. As I said, I'm a wordy kind of guy. So I'm going to sort of skip and jump a little bit over some of them, some maybe more than others. But this one is a model about trying to think about the role of AI agents in platforms, in the world around us. A lot of what Pablo's been speaking about. And it defines kind of 2 vectors. So one is about the amount of knowledge we have about an agent versus, the amount of cultural alignment between the agent, the AI agent, and the user. And that throws up sort of 4 potential roles that an AI agent may take on. But the point here is that I don't have the answers to AI and what it's going to lead to and how we're going to use it. It's a messy and very messy and ambiguous space. But what a model can do is take that mess and the apparent arbitrariness of everything and just put it into something more graspable, more orderly, and in so doing to transform people's cognitive operations, right? Back to this idea of enchantment. It can take something and change it into something more useful. The second thing that models do is that they disturb the way that we look at the world, the understood ways of looking at the world. And if there's one thing that I'm in the business of, it's trying to get people to think differently about the world, to turn on some light bulbs in people's heads. So this is, unfortunately, another slide about AI, but we worked on this long before AI walked amongst us like a sort of annoying superhuman. And it just took the concept of work, which we can kind of just assume we all know what work is, right? But of course, work is a little bit more complex than just work. It takes on in lots of different forms. Some work we do with others, we co-create, and some we do on our own. And some is very, very complex and perhaps not very everyday, and some of it is very routine and dull, some might say, to be got past as quickly as possible. So this initial model gave us a way, in the context of some work we did for Google, for thinking about where do people want AI to play? Is it with the complex, the special work that people do that's really integral to their identity? Or do we want to help people with the routine, the dull, the boring, the expenses, the calendaring, etc.? And what are the choices that we make as we move around these 4 quadrants? The third idea is about models that help us manage complexity. This slide was made by BCG for a company that's probably still not very popular for good reason in India, Union Carbide. And it was an effort to try and make sense of a very sprawling product portfolio and a very complex set of operations. And it became known as the $1 million slide because once they'd filled it in, not with little emojis, but with real data, it begat so much consulting work for BCG, millions of dollars worth of work, So it's a very, very simple diagram. Of course, getting to those vectors is the difficult bit. But once they've done that, and they still do it, they still have a whole team devoted to what they call the growth share model. They had turned something sprawling and multinational and incredibly complicated into something very simple. Where are our cash cows? Which are our dog businesses? Which are the real stars? And which are the ones that we have to ask some questions about? The fourth idea is that models, perhaps back to this idea of propaganda, provide a shared intellectual scaffolding. And I had to laugh on Tuesday when somebody I was co-hosting a workshop with pulled up the Design Council's Double Diamond, because nothing for me represents, for this sort of community, such a good example of a shared piece of scaffolding. It originated when the Design Council was trying to articulate, but realized that it wasn't doing a very good job of it, of what the process of strategic design actually looked like. They hadn't modeled it. They just had words, words, words. So by creating a double diamond and being able to articulate this messy process, they were able to communicate it. And now a simple Google image search will show you millions of iterations of the double diamond. So I'd ask you to think about the ways in which your models might provide the shared scaffolding that you need and your teams and your businesses need in your everyday work. And if you get to the right one, it can be incredibly durable. Similarly, this idea of propaganda is, dare I say it, is about herding audiences into cognitive spaces that we've defined. I mean, we're in the job of influencing direction, right? Of trying to get people to do the right thing, not the wrong thing. The right thing at the right time, and that requires propaganda. And a model can be very, very useful. I won't go into this one in detail because I want to save some time for questions, but a model can be very useful for herding clients into that place, right? For kind of forcing them, causing them to perceive reality in the way that's favorable to perhaps your interests, but perhaps to people's wider interests, to society's wider interests too, right? So these models have the ability to enchant. Models aren't just static things. Go back to the net, maybe, but go back to the thinking that I outlined about the net, right? They're not just beautiful things, and these slides, some of them are more beautiful than others, mainly because I didn't go anywhere near them. They don't just describe the world, they can change it. So they can take a set of givens, a business's capabilities, its resources, its appetite, whatever the current state is, and ask some questions about, well, given those assets, those capabilities, where do we want to be, right? Models allow us to bridge that gap between now and the future, between the present and some more desirable future state. And of course, models, I've talked a lot, probably because I'm a consultant, about what they do to other people. But of course, they're very useful for us. They help us get to the simplicity, that hallowed ground that always seems to be just round the corner. They help us get from the simplicity that sits on the other side of complexity. So I love this model, obviously. I like models. Because I think it shows us, it shows a real failing of researchers, right, who are really good when they have a very poor understanding of things. They're really good at communicating it. If they've got any humility, they would recognize that. But when you've done some research, you have a good understanding, but you still can't quite communicate it, which is where models come in. Enter the model, right? And by working on models with your teams, I think you can get both to a better, clearer understanding, but you also have an ability to communicate better. And if nothing else, we're in the business of communication. So let's go back to that specter that's going to haunt this conference hall and probably going to haunt most businesses and most people for the rest of time, which is our friend AI. Because for me, process matters, right? It's inherently a desirable thing. It's not what we get to that matters so much as where we get to. I don't listen to a Beethoven symphony at 4 times the speed because I need to get to the end. I listen to it at regular speed because I want to enjoy it, because the process of listening to music matters, not the process or not the point, not the end point of having listened to it. And I think we often look at photography, right, as a lesser art than painting, right? Because it involves equipment, it involves some other forms of technologies. But I think Ansel Adams here, taking photographs in Yosemite, demonstrates, as I've said earlier, that process matters, right? We are not paid just to deliver a thing, right? We are paid to run a process through which other things happen. Coalitions of the willing are created. Teams are aligned. That matters too. And so I want to leave you with the idea that if we rush to think, oh, these wonderful AI tools, and I don't think they're wonderful personally, can get us somewhere quicker, faster, it won't necessarily be better. Outcomes matter, of course they do, but processes inherently matter. Right? So in that context where everything has a little sparkle nowadays, right, models are our magic. Models matter because they are about craft, right? And what we produce is important, but how we produce it as a community desperately matters. And if you let go of that idea, then yes, open the door to AI and then get your begging bowl out. Don't do it. Don't do it. We need to reclaim our craft. Whether you're a designer, an engineer, whatever surfaces you work on, right? It matters what you do and how you do it. And if you forget that, wave goodbye to your profession. So I'll leave you, having lectured you, sorry about that, but I feel very strongly about these things. I'll leave you with a more positive thought, which is that our skills, whatever tribe, community, caste you come from, our skill is destined to carry on. Why? Because we're always involved with technology. We're always rubbing up against things that seek to make our life a little bit easier, but deep down they always require a negotiation, some way of finding a different way of doing things, a different way of getting to an outcome. Right? So there are no closures and there are no finalities in the world of mechanization. Our craft will always continue if we want it to, and it philosophically, I think it always will. It's a political choice whether as a community we want to make some decisions and just bow down at the altar of superintelligence, which is a bullshit idea. And so if you haven't had enough models, I've got 1 minute left, but if you haven't had enough models, Stripe Partners produces one every month, and you can subscribe to it, and it's quite nice. So thank you for having me, and I hope I've left you with something to think about.